I'm Ethan Mitchell, 32 years old, and I still remember the exact tone of my mother's voice when she said, "Don't come for Christmas." So calm, like she was discussing the weather, not cutting her firstborn son out of the family. My brother Mason's words were even crueler. "We'll pretend we don't know you." All because of a family business dispute that wasn't even my fault. As December approached, I sat alone in my Seattle apartment, wondering how my entire family had turned against me. Before I tell you how my family disowned me over something I didn't even do, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and subscribe if family drama is your thing. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, Christmas was always special in the Mitchell household. Our home would transform into a winter wonderland, with my mother Deborah spending weeks perfecting every decoration. My father Richard was the backbone of our family traditions, building gingerbread houses from scratch, taking us to pick the perfect Douglas fir, and reading A Christmas Carol by the fireplace on Christmas Eve. "Family is everything, Ethan," my father would tell me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "When the world turns its back on you, family is the shelter that never falls." The irony of those words would haunt me years later. I was always the responsible one, 4 years older than Mason, who somehow managed to charm his way out of every difficult situation. When we broke a window playing baseball in the backyard, I took the blame. When Mason crashed Dad's car at 17, I helped cover the repair costs from my college fund. That was just how our family worked. I protected, Mason charmed, Mom mediated, and Dad led. Mitchell Hardware Supplies had been my father's pride and joy. What started as a single storefront had grown into a chain of 12 locations across Oregon, providing construction supplies to contractors and DIYers alike. Richard Mitchell built his business on reliability and personal relationships, knowing customers by name and remembering their projects. "This business is your inheritance," he'd say to Mason and me. "Not just the stores, but the reputation. A Mitchell always delivers on their promises." After graduating with my business degree, I joined the company full-time. Mason followed years later, after bouncing between 3 different colleges and finally finishing with a marketing degree. I worked my way through every department: warehouse, sales, purchasing, operations, while Mason went straight into marketing. When my father passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, the family dynamics shifted. My mother, grief-stricken and overwhelmed, leaned heavily on my father's brother, Uncle Dennis, who stepped in to help run the business. I didn't mind at first. We all needed support, and Uncle Dennis had decades of retail experience. Jessica, my fiancée of 2 years, was the one who first suggested modernizing the company. "Your father built something amazing," she said one evening as we reviewed the quarterly numbers in our apartment. "But e-commerce is taking over everywhere. If Mitchell Hardware doesn't adapt, you might not have anything to inherit." Jessica worked as a digital marketing consultant and had helped several traditional businesses transition to online platforms. She showed me case studies of regional hardware suppliers who had doubled their revenue by implementing robust e-commerce solutions while maintaining their brick-and-mortar presence. I spent 6 months researching, consulting with industry experts, and developing a comprehensive e-commerce strategy for Mitchell Hardware. The plan would require investment but promised to expand our reach beyond Oregon and future-proof the business my father had built. I created detailed financial projections, implementation timelines, and marketing strategies. This wasn't just about preserving our family legacy, it was about growing it. The morning of the family business meeting, I felt genuinely excited. Jessica helped me prepare my presentation, and I rehearsed it repeatedly until I knew every slide by heart. "They're going to love it," Jessica said, straightening my tie. "Your father would be so proud of this vision." I kissed her goodbye and headed to my mother's house, where we held all-important family meetings in my father's old study. The drive was peaceful, with autumn leaves scattering across the road and the promise of a new chapter for Mitchell Hardware filling my thoughts. I had no idea that instead of opening that new chapter, my family was about to try to write me out of the story entirely. The tension was palpable when I walked into my father's study. My mother sat at the head of the table, a position that had been my father's, with Uncle Dennis to her right and Mason to her left. Patricia, our CFO, who had been with the company for over 20 years, sat quietly in the corner, her laptop open and ready to take notes. "Ethan, you're late," Uncle Dennis said, though I was precisely on time according to the email invitation. "Sorry if I kept everyone waiting," I replied, taking the only remaining seat across from them. It felt like a tribunal rather than a family meeting. I connected my laptop to the projector and began my presentation. I spoke about the changing retail landscape, the growth of online shopping, and the opportunity for Mitchell Hardware to expand beyond its geographical limitations. I shared examples of regional hardware companies that had successfully implemented e-commerce strategies and outlined how we could do the same while maintaining our commitment to customer service. The initial investment would be offset by projected revenue increases within 18 months, I explained, showing the financial projections I had meticulously prepared. And we'd be preserving Dad's legacy by ensuring the business remains competitive for decades to come. As I finished, I expected questions, perhaps concerns about implementation details or timeline adjustments. What I didn't expect was the cold silence that followed. Mason cleared his throat. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan. Very theoretical." He stood up and connected his own laptop to the projector. "While you've been dreaming about website shopping carts, Dennis and I have been developing a real modernization plan based on actual customer feedback." I watched in disbelief as Mason presented a completely different proposal, one focused on renovating our existing stores with digital kiosks and expanding into home improvement services. It wasn't a bad plan on its surface, but it completely ignored the e-commerce trends that threatened our business model. "We've already conducted market research," Mason continued, nodding toward Uncle Dennis. "Our customers prefer the in-person experience. They want to touch and feel products before buying. An e-commerce focus would alienate our core customer base." Uncle Dennis nodded approvingly. "Richard always said that hardware is a hands-on business. People need to see the quality before they buy." I glanced at my mother, expecting her to at least acknowledge that both proposals deserved consideration. Instead, she was smiling at Mason with unmistakable pride. "The service expansion is exactly what your father would have wanted," she said. "He always talked about helping customers from project planning to completion." "Mom," I interjected, "Dad also believed in evolution. The market is changing. If we don't change with it, your brother's plan maintains the personal touch that makes Mitchell Hardware special." Uncle Dennis interrupted. "Your proposal turns us into just another website." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. "What if we integrated elements from both plans?" I suggested, trying to find middle ground. "We could implement the e-commerce platform while also enhancing the in-store experience with." "The budget won't allow for both," Uncle Dennis stated firmly. "We need to choose a direction." The conversation continued for another hour, but it was clear that minds had been made up before I even walked into the room. Every point I raised was dismissed or minimized. When I questioned the financial projections in Mason's plan, Uncle Dennis insisted they had been thoroughly vetted. "I think we should take some time to consider both proposals," my mother finally said, though her tone made it clear which way she was leaning. "This is a big decision for the company's future." As we gathered our materials to leave, I overheard Uncle Dennis whisper to Mason, "Good job, son. Your father would be proud." Son. Uncle Dennis had never called me that, not once in the 3 years since my father died. I approached Patricia as she was packing up her laptop. "Were you involved in preparing Mason's proposal?" I asked quietly. She hesitated before answering. "I was asked to review some numbers, but I wasn't part of the development team." Something in her expression suggested there was more she wasn't saying. On my way out, I tried to speak with my mother. "Mom, I wish you had told me Mason was working on his own proposal. We could have collaborated instead of competing." She patted my arm distractedly. "Sometimes a little healthy competition is good for business, honey. We'll discuss this more at the next board meeting. As I drove home, the excitement I had felt that morning was replaced by a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just that my proposal hadn't been enthusiastically received, it was the feeling that I had somehow become an outsider in my own family business. Still, I tried to remain optimistic. Perhaps after reviewing both proposals more thoroughly, they would see the merits of my approach. Perhaps this was just a miscommunication that could be resolved with more discussion. I had no idea that this meeting was just the first step in a systematic campaign to push me out of the company my father had built, and ultimately, out of the family altogether. The next 3 months were an exercise in frustration and growing isolation. What started as subtle exclusion soon became impossible to ignore. First, it was discovering that a supplier meeting had been rescheduled without anyone informing me. Then it was emails regarding inventory decisions that somehow missed my inbox. By the 3rd week, I was routinely walking into conversations that abruptly stopped when I entered the room. "I'm sure it was just an oversight," my mother said when I called her about being excluded from a meeting with our bank. "Dennis probably thought you were too busy with your other projects." "What other projects?" My only focus was the family business. On a Tuesday morning in late October, I called Mason about a discrepancy I'd found in the quarterly marketing budget. "That's not really your department, is it?" Mason replied, his voice cool and dismissive. "Why don't you stick to operations and let me handle marketing?" "Because we're $500,000 over budget with no corresponding increase in sales," I countered. "As a company executive and family member, I have every right to ask questions." "Look, Ethan," Mason sighed, as if explaining something to a child. "Mom and Dennis have approved my marketing strategy. If you have concerns, take them to the board." That's exactly what I'm trying to do, but somehow I'm never informed about board meetings anymore. Mason's laugh had an edge to it. "Maybe if you spent more time at the office instead of working on your little online shopping project, you'd be in the loop." The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with Mason suggesting I needed to get with the program or get out of the way. A week later, while searching for a supplier contract in the shared drive, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Restructuring 2024. Inside were documents outlining a complete reorganization of the company leadership, with Mason promoted to Chief Operations Officer and my position conspicuously absent from the new organizational chart. The document had been last modified by Uncle Dennis 2 days before my e-commerce presentation. They had never intended to consider my proposal. The decision to sideline me had been made before I even had a chance to speak. That evening, I drove to my mother's house unannounced. I found her in the garden, pruning roses in the fading autumn light. "Mom, we need to talk about what's happening at the company." She didn't look up from her flowers. "What do you mean, dear?" "I mean the fact that I'm being systematically excluded from decisions. That Mason and Uncle Dennis had already planned a restructuring that pushes me out before I even presented my e-commerce proposal." She finally turned to face me, secateur still in hand. "Ethan, you're being dramatic. No one is pushing you out. The company is evolving, and we all need to adapt to new roles." "New roles?" "Mom, they're planning to demote me. My name isn't even on the new org chart. Perhaps Dennis is just considering options. Nothing has been decided yet." "Then why wasn't I informed about these discussions? Why am I finding out about them by accident?" She sighed and removed her gardening gloves. "Honey, ever since your father died, you've been so rigid about how the business should run. Dennis has decades of retail experience, and Mason brings fresh marketing perspective. Sometimes you need to trust that others might know what's best." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad built this company from nothing. He trained me in every aspect of the business. And now you're saying I should step aside and let Uncle Dennis and Mason, who barely showed interest in the company until recently, make all the decisions. That's not what I said. Her voice took on the patient tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "I'm saying that you need to be more flexible, more willing to compromise. Compromise requires communication, Mom. They're not communicating with me, they're excluding me." Our conversation went in circles, with my mother deflecting or minimizing every concern I raised. When I mentioned that Mason seemed to be manipulating inventory numbers to make his department look better, she actually suggested I might be jealous of my younger brother's success. The following week, Kevin, our longtime warehouse manager who had been with the company since I was a teenager, pulled me aside after hours. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he said, nervously glancing toward the offices, "but something's not right with the inventory counts. We're showing purchases that never arrived and stock levels that don't match what's on the shelves. I've noticed discrepancies in the reports," I admitted. "Do you know who's responsible?" Kevin hesitated. "All I know is that Mr. Dennis and your brother have been spending a lot of time with the inventory system, and they've restricted access to certain reports. When I asked questions, I was told it was executive-level restructuring and not to worry about it." He slipped me a flash drive. "I made copies of the original inventory reports before they were altered. I've worked for your father too long to stand by while something shady happens to his company." That night, I reviewed the files Kevin had provided. The discrepancies weren't minor accounting errors. They were systematic manipulations that painted a much healthier financial picture than reality. Certain product lines showed profitable sales despite actually operating at a loss. Expenses had been redistributed across departments to inflate Mason's marketing success while making my operational area look inefficient. The next morning, I received an email announcement about a special board meeting scheduled for the following week. The agenda included a single item: management restructuring proposal. I forwarded the email to Patricia with a simple question: "Do you know what this is about?" Her reply came hours later: "I suggest you prepare yourself, Ethan, and back up any personal files you have on company devices." The warning was clear. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. When I tried calling Uncle Dennis to discuss the meeting, his assistant said he was unavailable. My emails went unanswered. Mason avoided me in the office, suddenly too busy with client meetings to talk. The day before the board meeting, I found a box on my desk with a note from the IT department. "As per Mr. Dennis Mitchell's instructions, please back up any personal files and return your company laptop after tomorrow's board meeting." They weren't just planning to demote me. They were planning to fire me from my own family's company. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the conference room of our flagship store. I arrived 30 minutes early, determined to speak with my mother before the others arrived. But when I walked in, everyone was already seated: my mother, Uncle Dennis, Mason, Patricia, and two company lawyers I recognized but had rarely worked with. "Ethan," Uncle Dennis said, his voice artificially pleasant, "thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." The only available chair was at the far end of the table, opposite everyone else. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "Before we begin," I said, remaining standing, "I'd like to understand the purpose of this meeting and why outside counsel is present." One of the lawyers, Harris, I think his name was, opened a folder. "Mr. Mitchell, we're here to address some concerning activities that have come to the board's attention." "What activities?" I asked, looking directly at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Uncle Dennis cleared his throat. "Ethan, we have evidence that you've been accessing confidential company information without authorization and possibly sharing it with outside parties." The accusation was so unexpected that I actually laughed. "What are you talking about?" Mason slid a document across the table. "We have logs showing you access restricted financial files at 11:42 p.m. last Tuesday, and then again at 1:15 a.m. Files were copied to an external device. Those were Kevin's files, the ones showing the inventory manipulation. But I hadn't accessed them directly, Kevin had. There's also evidence," Uncle Dennis continued, "that you've been communicating with Webfront Solutions about implementing an e-commerce platform despite the board's decision not to pursue that direction." Webfront was the development company Jessica had recommended. I had contacted them for a preliminary quote months ago, before my proposal was rejected. "I was gathering information for my proposal," I explained. "That's not unauthorized, it's due diligence. You've continued communications with them as recently as last week, Mason countered, pushing another document forward, a printed email that had somehow been obtained from my personal account. I looked at Patricia, whose face remained carefully neutral. These accusations are ridiculous. If anyone has been acting inappropriately, it's Mason and Uncle Dennis. They've been manipulating inventory numbers to make the financial situation look better than it is. That's a serious allegation, one of the lawyers said, his pen poised above his notepad. I have evidence, I replied, reaching for my bag. Fabricated evidence, Mason interjected. Created to deflect from your own actions. My mother finally spoke. Ethan, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Make what more difficult, Mom? The fact that your brother-in-law and younger son are systematically pushing me out of the company Dad built? The company he wanted me to lead? Your father wanted what was best for the company, Uncle Dennis said. And right now your behavior is harmful to Mitchell Hardware. For the next hour, they presented their case against me, a carefully constructed narrative painting me as a resentful executive undermining the company from within. Every document I had viewed, every question I had asked, every concern I had raised was reframed as evidence of my disloyalty. Patricia sat silently through most of it, occasionally confirming financial details when directly asked but offering no opinions. Her discomfort was visible only in the way she repeatedly adjusted her glasses, a nervous habit I'd noticed over years of working together. When they had finished laying out their accusations, Uncle Dennis pushed a document toward me. This offers you a generous severance package in exchange for your resignation and surrender of all company shares. Given the circumstances, it's more than fair. I didn't touch the paper. And if I refuse? Then the company will pursue legal action regarding the unauthorized access and potential corporate espionage, the lawyer replied smoothly. I looked at each of them in turn, Uncle Dennis with his practiced concern, Mason with barely concealed triumph, the lawyers with professional detachment, Patricia with evident discomfort, and finally, my mother. Mom, I said, my voice cracking slightly. You know this isn't right. Dad would never have allowed this. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, doubt, perhaps, or pain. But then Mason touched her arm, and her expression hardened. Your father isn't here, Ethan. We have to make decisions based on what's best for the family and the business now. And I'm not part of that family anymore? Not part of the business? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, I think it would be best if you took some time away. Give yourself space to think about your next steps. Mason, emboldened by my mother's apparent support, added, Maybe don't plan on joining us for the holidays this year. It would be awkward. The casual cruelty of his words stunned me into silence. My mother nodded slightly. Don't come for Christmas, she said calmly, like it was no big deal. We all need some time to process this situation. In that moment, something broke inside me, the last threads of hope that this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved. My own mother was calmly cutting me out of the family as easily as she might cancel a dinner reservation. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. You have no idea what you're doing, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos inside me. No idea what this will cost all of us. I left without taking the severance agreement, without looking back at the family that had just disowned me. In the parking lot, I found a security guard waiting beside my car with a box of personal items from my office. Sorry, Mr. Mitchell, he said awkwardly. I was told to collect your badge and key card. I handed them over wordlessly and placed the box in my trunk. As I drove away from Mitchell Hardware for what I thought would be the last time, my phone buzzed with a text from Mason. We'll pretend we don't know you. It's better that way. December in Seattle was even grayer than usual. Or maybe it just seemed that way from the isolation of my apartment. I had barely left home in the 3 weeks since the board meeting, except for necessary groceries and one half-hearted attempt at Christmas shopping that ended with me sitting in a mall food court, watching families and feeling like an alien observer of human connection. Jessica tried her best to pull me out of my depression. She decorated our apartment with tasteful Christmas lights, played holiday music, and invited friends over for dinner, friends who tactfully avoided asking about my family plans. "You should fight this, Ethan," she said one evening as we sat on the couch, a Christmas movie playing unwatched on the TV. "What they did wasn't just wrong, it was potentially illegal." "They're my family," I replied, the words automatic now after weeks of the same conversation. "Was my family," I corrected myself. "Family doesn't manipulate financial records. Family doesn't fabricate evidence against you. Family doesn't disown you for trying to protect the company." She was right, of course. But the thought of taking legal action against my mother, my brother, it felt like giving up on any possibility of reconciliation, however remote that possibility might be. The day before Christmas Eve, I was sorting through old files, more out of restlessness than any real purpose, when I found the flash drive Kevin had given me. I hadn't looked at it since before the board meeting, too wounded by the betrayal to face the evidence. With nothing else to occupy my thoughts, I plugged it in and began reviewing the documents more thoroughly. What I found made my blood run cold. The inventory manipulations weren't just about making Mason's marketing initiatives look more successful. There were patterns of missing inventory, duplicated orders to suppliers that showed in the system but never appeared in the warehouse, and systematic discrepancies that pointed to money being siphoned out of the company. I called Kevin, but his wife answered and told me he had been let go the week after my departure. "Restructuring," she said bitterly. I was still staring at the spreadsheets, trying to make sense of the scale of the deception, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Is this Ethan Mitchell?" a deep, professional voice asked when I answered. "Yes." "Who's this?" "My name is Thomas Reynolds. I'm an attorney representing Patricia Wilson." "Patricia?" Our CFO had never mentioned legal representation. "Ms. Wilson asked me to contact you regarding some concerns about Mitchell Hardware Supplies. She believes you might share these concerns and suggested you might have relevant information." My heart raced. "What kind of concerns?" "I'd prefer not to discuss details over the phone. Would you be available to meet tomorrow morning at my office?" I agreed, too curious, and if I'm honest, too hopeful, to refuse. The law offices of Reynolds and Braddock occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Seattle building with spectacular views of Elliott Bay. Thomas Reynolds was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of corporate malfeasance imaginable. Patricia was already seated in the conference room when I arrived. She looked different outside the company setting, more confident, less constrained. "Thank you for coming, Ethan," she said, extending her hand. "I owe you an apology for my silence during that board meeting. I should have spoken up." "Why didn't you?" I asked, the question more tired than accusatory. "Because I needed more evidence," she replied. "And I needed to make sure I had protected myself legally before challenging your uncle and brother." She opened a laptop and turned it toward me. "I've been documenting irregularities in the company finances for over a year. At first, I thought they were just sloppy accounting practices from Mason's department. But after your father died and Dennis took a more active role, the patterns became too consistent to be mistakes." Thomas Reynolds placed a thick folder on the table. "Ms. Wilson resigned from Mitchell Hardware last week and brought her documentation to me. What she's uncovered appears to be a systematic embezzlement scheme." "Embezzlement?" The word hung in the air, making real what I had only begun to suspect. "Your brother and uncle have been siphoning funds through fake vendor accounts, inflated marketing expenses, and inventory manipulation," Patricia explained. "Based on my calculations, they've diverted approximately $3 million over the past 2 years. $3 million. I echoed, thinking of all the family business had meant to my father. "Does my mother know?" Patricia and Thomas exchanged glances. "We're not certain," Thomas said carefully. "There's no evidence of her direct involvement, but as a board member and majority shareholder, she would have had to sign off on certain transactions. She trusts Dennis completely," I said, more to myself than to them. "She might have signed whatever he put in front of her." That's possible, Patricia agreed. But at some point, willful ignorance becomes complicity. Thomas Reynolds leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Wilson has already filed a whistleblower report with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Given your position as a former executive and shareholder, your testimony would significantly strengthen the case. I stared out at the gray waters of the bay, watching a ferry slowly make its way toward the terminal. Taking legal action against my own family. It's not an easy decision. I understand, Thomas said. But consider this, your father built that company on integrity. Would he want its legacy to be destroyed by fraud? The question hit me like a physical blow. My father's voice echoed in my memory. A Mitchell always delivers on their promises. What would happen? I asked. If we proceed with this. Best case scenario, your uncle and brother return the embezzled funds, face criminal charges, and the company undergoes a complete restructuring under new leadership. Worst case, the scandal becomes public, the company's reputation suffers irreparable damage, and Mitchell Hardware may not survive. Neither option sounded appealing, but the thought of my father's life's work being hollowed out from within by people he had trusted was even worse. I need to try one more thing before we proceed, I said finally. I need to talk to my mother directly, make her understand what's happening. Patricia looked skeptical. They've already convinced her you're the problem, Ethan. I have to try, I insisted. She deserves one more chance to do the right thing. That evening, I called my mother's number, expecting it to go to voicemail as it had for weeks. To my surprise, it rang and rang without switching to messaging. Finally, I hung up and sent a text. Mom, we need to talk. It's important. Please call me. No response came that night, nor the next morning. As Christmas Eve settled over Seattle with a light dusting of snow, I realized I had to make a decision without my mother's input. The evidence was clear. The right path was clear, however painful. I called Thomas Reynolds and told him I would cooperate with the investigation. You're doing the right thing, he assured me. I'll prepare the necessary documentation, and we can meet again after the holidays. After hanging up, I sat in my silent apartment, looking at the small Christmas tree Jessica had insisted on decorating. For the first time since that terrible board meeting, I felt something other than despair, a quiet determination that whatever happened next, I would face it with the integrity my father had taught me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Kevin. Heard you met with Patricia. They're planning to sell the company to Westland Building Supply. Board meeting scheduled for January 5th. Thought you should know. Westland was our biggest competitor, a corporate giant that had been trying to buy Mitchell Hardware for years. My father had always refused their offers, knowing they would dismantle the company and absorb only the profitable parts. They weren't just stealing from the company. They were planning to sell my father's legacy to the highest bidder. The day after Christmas, Jessica and I met with Thomas Reynolds and Patricia to review all the evidence. Thomas had brought in a forensic accountant who walked us through the complex web of financial manipulations that Mason and Uncle Dennis had created. They've been quite sophisticated, the accountant explained, pointing to a flowchart on the conference room screen. They created shell vendor companies that billed Mitchell Hardware for services never rendered. The payments went to accounts they controlled. How did they hide this from the regular audits? I asked. They didn't need to hide much, Patricia explained. As CFO, I would normally have caught these discrepancies, but Dennis restructured the financial reporting processes after your father died. He insisted on reviewing all reports before they went to the board, and he had final approval on which external auditing firm we used. The accountant nodded. They also used the modernization plan as cover. Many of the fraudulent payments were categorized as consulting fees or software development costs for the store upgrades. And now they're planning to sell to Westland. I said, the betrayal still fresh. They've stripped the company of assets, and now want to cash out before anyone notices. Thomas Reynolds tapped his pen thoughtfully on the table. The sale to Westland gives us both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, once the company is sold, it becomes much harder to recover damages. On the other hand, the sale process requires due diligence and disclosure, which might expose the fraud without us having to initiate legal proceedings. What do you mean? Jessica asked. If Westland's lawyers discover financial irregularities during their review, they might withdraw their offer or significantly reduce it. That could force your mother to ask questions she's been avoiding. Or it could make Dennis and Mason rush the sale through before anyone notices, Patricia countered. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the post-Christmas shoppers on the streets below. We can't wait and hope Westland's lawyers find something. We need to act before the January 5th board meeting. What are you suggesting? Thomas asked. I want to confront them directly, all of them, together, with the evidence we have. Give my mother one last chance to see the truth before we involve the authorities. Thomas looked concerned. That's a risky approach, Ethan. They could destroy evidence or accelerate their plans. Or they could realize they're caught and try to make this right, I argued. My mother isn't a criminal. She's been manipulated by people she trusted during a vulnerable time. She deserves to hear the truth from me, face to face. Jessica took my hand. I think Ethan's right. Before we start a legal battle that could destroy the family completely, we should try direct confrontation. After some discussion, we developed a plan. Patricia would compile a comprehensive report of the financial evidence. Thomas would prepare a preliminary legal assessment outlining the potential criminal and civil charges. And I would prepare myself for the hardest conversation of my life. Jessica and I spent the next several days rehearsing what I would say, anticipating counterarguments, and practicing how to present the evidence clearly and unemotionally. Thomas advised me on which aspects of the fraud carried the most serious legal consequences. Remember, he said during our final preparation meeting, your goal isn't to threaten or accuse. It's to present the facts so clearly that denial becomes impossible. On New Year's Eve, while most people were celebrating, I was reviewing financial records and practicing my opening statement. Jessica tried to convince me to take a break and watch the fireworks from our balcony, but my mind couldn't escape the looming confrontation. What if she still doesn't believe me? I asked as we stood watching the Space Needle light up the night sky. What if she chooses them over me again? Jessica squeezed my hand. Then you'll know you did everything possible to give her the chance to make the right choice. The rest is up to her. January 4th arrived cold and clear. I had decided to confront them the day before the scheduled board meeting with Westland, hoping to prevent the sale before it could be finalized. Jessica drove me to my mother's house, promising to wait nearby in case I needed her. Remember, she said as she dropped me off, you're not just fighting for your place in the company. You're fighting for your father's legacy and everything he believed in. I nodded, too nervous to speak, and walked up the familiar path to the front door. Through the window, I could see the Christmas tree still standing in the living room, decorated with the ornaments my father had collected over decades. My childhood, my family history, was contained in that house, and I was now an outsider, knocking on the door instead of walking in. To my surprise, Mason answered. His expression shifted from shock to anger in an instant. What are you doing here? He demanded, blocking the doorway. I need to speak with Mom. And you, and Uncle Dennis. There's nothing to discuss. The lawyers have been clear about. Mason, who is it? My mother's voice called from inside. She appeared behind him, her face paling when she saw me. Ethan. I didn't expect you. Obviously, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Can I come in? It's important. Mason started to object, but my mother silenced him with a gesture. Let him in. Your uncle is here too. We might as well hear what he has to say. The living room was exactly as I remembered it, the familiar setting making the estrangement even more painful. Uncle Dennis sat in my father's chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. He didn't stand when I entered. Ethan, he said coldly, this is unexpected. I know about the embezzlement, I said without preamble, placing my briefcase on the coffee table. I know about the shell companies, the inflated marketing expenses, the inventory manipulation. And I know about the planned sale to Westland. The room went completely silent. Mason's face flushed red, Uncle Dennis froze with his glass halfway to his lips, and my mother looked confused. What are you talking about? She asked. I opened the briefcase and took out the report Patricia had prepared. $3 million has been systematically siphoned from the company over the past 2 years. The money was funneled through fake vendor accounts controlled by Mason and Uncle Dennis. That's absurd. Uncle Dennis scoffed, but I noticed he wouldn't need my eyes. I turned to my mother. Mom, they've been stealing from Dad's company. They pushed me out because I was getting too close to discovering it. And now they're planning to sell what's left to Westland before anyone catches on. He's desperate, Mason interjected. Making up wild accusations because he's bitter about being fired. These aren't accusations, I replied, laying out the documents on the coffee table. These are bank records, vendor contracts for services never performed, inventory reports showing discrepancies that can't be explained by normal business operations. My mother picked up one of the papers, her hand trembling slightly. Where did you get these? Patricia compiled them before she resigned. She's been documenting the fraud for over a year. Uncle Dennis stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Deborah, you can't possibly believe these fabricated documents over your own family. I turned to him, anger finally breaking through my carefully maintained composure. Family? You stole from your brother's company. You manipulated his widow. You tried to destroy his son's reputation. Is that how family acts, Uncle Dennis? Enough! My mother exclaimed, still staring at the documents. Dennis, is this true? Have you and Mason been taking money from the company? Uncle Dennis attempted to look offended. Of course not. These are complex financial matters that Ethan doesn't understand. The transactions he's questioning were all legitimate business expenses for the modernization project. $3 million in consulting fees to a company that doesn't exist? I challenged. Inventory purchases that never arrived at the warehouse? Marketing campaigns that no one can document? Mason moved toward the door. This is a waste of time. We have lawyers to deal with these kinds of allegations. Running away, Mason? I asked. Just like you're planning to run away after selling Dad's company to Westland? How much are they paying you under the table to push this deal through? My mother's head snapped up. Westland? What is he talking about, Mason? Mason hesitated, and in that moment I knew I had found a thread my mother hadn't been aware of. They didn't tell you about the Westland deal, did they, Mom? They scheduled a board meeting for tomorrow to approve the sale of Mitchell Hardware to our biggest competitor, the same company Dad refused to sell to for 20 years. The color drained from my mother's face. Dennis? Is this true? Uncle Dennis shot Mason a furious look before composing himself. We've received an offer, yes. It's an excellent opportunity for the family to cash out at a premium. Cash out? My mother's voice was barely a whisper. Richard never wanted to sell to Westland. He knew they would dismantle everything he built. Richard isn't here, Uncle Dennis said sharply, echoing the words my mother had said to me months ago. We have to make decisions based on current business realities. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out one last document, my father's letter to me on my 30th birthday, 2 years before his death. I handed it to my mother. Dad wrote this to me, Mom. Read the third paragraph. Her hands shaking, she unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. I built Mitchell Hardware not just as a business, but as a legacy for our family and community. I've turned down offers from Westland and other chains because our independence is what allows us to serve our customers with integrity and personal attention. Never sell that independence, Ethan, no matter how tempting the offer might be. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up from the letter. I never knew he wrote this to you. Because he trusted me to protect his legacy, I said quietly. That's what I've been trying to do. The confrontation continued for hours. Uncle Dennis attempted to justify the financial manipulations as aggressive tax planning. Mason eventually admitted to knowing about the shell companies but claimed Uncle Dennis had assured him it was all legal. My mother sat silently through most of it, the evidence piling up around her like a physical weight. When Uncle Dennis tried to leave, claiming he needed to consult his notes at home, I blocked his path. The authorities have already been notified, I informed him. Patricia filed a whistleblower report with the SEC. If you try to destroy evidence now, you'll only be adding to the charges. Charges? My mother asked weakly. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. I listed. Unless the money is returned and the company restored to proper management, this will become a criminal matter. Mason, who had been increasingly agitated, suddenly made a dash for the door. I let him go, knowing there was nowhere he could run that would protect him from the consequences of his actions. As the door slammed behind him, my mother buried her face in her hands. How did we come to this? She whispered. I sat beside her, not touching her but close enough that she could reach for me if she wanted to. They took advantage of your trust, Mom. And your grief. Uncle Dennis, seeing his ally gone and his schemes exposed, finally dropped the pretense. You have no idea what it was like, he said bitterly. Working alongside Richard all those years, watching him build this empire while I remained his second in command. Then he leaves everything to you and the boys, as if I hadn't sacrificed just as much. So you decided to take what you thought you deserved? I asked. I deserved recognition. Respect. A seat at the head of the table. His composure completely abandoned, Uncle Dennis looked suddenly old and pathetic. Your precious father wasn't the saint you think he was, Ethan. He was calculating and stubborn and… Get out, my mother said, her voice quiet but firm. Get out of my house, Dennis. And don't come back. After he left, my mother and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes red but clear. What happens now? She asked. That depends on what you want to do, Mom. We can try to recover the stolen funds and rebuild the company. Or we can let the authorities handle it and accept the consequences. She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since my father died, I saw the strength that had made her his perfect partner for 30 years. We rebuild, she said decisively. Richard's legacy deserves nothing less. In that moment, as the winter afternoon faded into evening, the first fragile threads of reconciliation began to form between us. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal challenges and painful revelations. But for the first time in months, I felt hope that my family, or at least part of it, might eventually heal. The months following that confrontation were some of the most challenging of my life. Just as Thomas Reynolds had predicted, the exposure of the fraud triggered both criminal and civil proceedings. Mason and Uncle Dennis were charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The legal system ground slowly forward, each hearing and deposition reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. My mother, once she accepted the full extent of the betrayal, became a fierce ally in rebuilding the company. She testified against Uncle Dennis, describing how he had systematically isolated her from financial decisions while using her grief to manipulate her trust. The prosecutors were less lenient with Mason, whose active participation could not be excused by the influence of an older relative. Patricia returned as CFO, her whistleblower status protecting her from any professional backlash. Together, we implemented a new financial oversight system with multiple layers of checks and balances to ensure nothing like this could happen again. Your father would be proud of you, Patricia told me one evening as we worked late reconstructing the company's financial history. Not just for exposing the fraud, but for how you've handled the aftermath. The aftermath included painful publicity as local business journals covered the scandal, difficult conversations with vendors and customers who had been unwittingly involved in the fraudulent schemes, and the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding trust within the organization. Kevin returned as warehouse manager, bringing with him several employees who had been unjustly terminated during Uncle Dennis's purge of potential whistleblowers. His loyalty was rewarded with a promotion to operations director, a position he accepted with characteristic humility. I just did what Mr. Richard would have expected from any of us, he said when I thanked him for providing the evidence that started the investigation. He always said the Mitchell name stood for something. The legal proceedings against Mason concluded with a plea deal, restitution of his portion of the embezzled funds, 5 years probation, and 2,000 hours of community service. Uncle Dennis, who had orchestrated the scheme and refused to accept responsibility, received a 3-year prison sentence. The judge, noting his age and health conditions, recommended a minimum security facility. My mother visited Uncle Dennis once before he began serving his sentence. She never told me exactly what was said during that meeting, but she returned with a quiet determination that hadn't been present before. Family is complicated, she said that evening as we shared dinner at her house. Richard always saw the best in Dennis, even when others didn't. I think he knew his brother's weaknesses but loved him anyway. Do you think Dad would have forgiven him for this? I asked. She considered the question carefully. I think he would have held him accountable while leaving the door open for redemption. Your father believed people could change if given the right motivation and support. As for Mason, his relationship with the family remained in limbo. My mother maintained contact with him, unable to completely sever ties with her younger son despite his betrayal. I was less forgiving, the wound still too fresh to contemplate reconciliation. Jessica gently encouraged me to consider the possibility of eventual forgiveness, not for Mason's sake but for my own. Carrying this anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, she said, quoting a wisdom that was cliched but nonetheless true. I began seeing a therapist to process the complex emotions surrounding the family trauma. Dr. Levine helped me understand that my feelings of betrayal were compounded by guilt. Guilt that I hadn't recognized the fraud sooner, guilt that I had failed to protect my father's legacy, guilt that I couldn't instantly forgive as I imagined my father might have done. Forgiveness isn't an event, it's a process, Dr. Levine explained. And it doesn't mean condoning what happened or pretending it didn't hurt you. It means freeing yourself from the control those events have over your present and future. With the legal issues slowly resolving, I turned my attention back to the business. The e-commerce platform I had originally proposed was finally implemented, opening new markets beyond our traditional Oregon territory. The online store preserved the personal touch that had always distinguished Mitchell Hardware, with features like video consultations with knowledgeable staff and customized project planning tools. Jessica's digital marketing expertise proved invaluable, helping us rebuild the company's reputation through transparent communication and community engagement. She officially joined Mitchell Hardware as marketing director, her outside perspective balanced by her deep understanding of our family values. By the following December, the company had stabilized financially and was beginning to grow again. We hadn't recovered all the embezzled funds, but the insurance settlement and civil judgments had restored enough capital to keep the business viable. As Christmas approached, Jessica and I discussed our plans. Your mother has invited us for Christmas Eve dinner, she reminded me gently. Have you decided if you want to go? The invitation had arrived a week earlier, a handwritten note rather than a text or email, my mother's way of signaling the importance of the gesture. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to rebuild that connection, but another part still associates that house with betrayal. What would your father want? Jessica asked, echoing the question that had guided so many of my decisions over the past year. That evening, I called my mother. We'd love to come for Christmas Eve, I told her. Can I bring anything? Her relief was audible. Just yourselves. And maybe that cranberry sauce Jessica makes? The one with orange zest? The fact that she remembered Jessica's contribution to our last family Christmas before everything fell apart felt like a small but significant bridge between past and present. Christmas Eve at my mother's house was different from any we had experienced before. The decorations were simpler, the guest list smaller, just my mother, Jessica, and me. Mason had been invited but declined, perhaps understanding that the wounds were still too fresh for comfortable celebration. My mother had prepared all the traditional dishes, though in smaller quantities. As we sat at the dining table that had hosted decades of family gatherings, the empty chairs seemed to represent both absence and possibility, space for new traditions, new relationships, new understanding. After dinner, my mother brought out a box I recognized from my childhood, the special ornaments that each family member hung on the tree themselves. "I thought we might continue the tradition," she said hesitantly, offering me the faded cardboard box. Inside were the ornaments my father had given me each year from birth until his death, 29 in total, each representing a milestone or interest from that year of my life. On top was one I didn't recognize, a miniature hardware store with Mitchell & Son painted on the tiny storefront. "I had this made last year," my mother explained. "Before everything happened. I never got to give it to you." The simple gesture broke something open inside me, not in the shattering way of the board meeting months ago, but in a healing way, like a dam releasing waters that had been held back too long. The following week, I visited Mason for the first time since his sentencing. He was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of Portland, working at a building supply company as part of his community service requirement. Our conversation was awkward, stilted by the weight of everything that had happened. He offered justifications, I countered with facts. He expressed resentment, I acknowledged my own anger. We circled each other verbally, either willing to fully bridge the gap. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said eventually. "Uncle Dennis said it was just creative accounting at first, and then suddenly we were in too deep to stop. You could have come to me," I replied. "Or Mom. We would have helped you find a way out." He looked away. "I was jealous of you. Always have been." Dad's golden boy, the responsible one, the successor. I wanted to prove I could do something bigger, better. And now? Now I'm just trying to get through each day without hating myself. The admission was surprisingly raw, the first truly honest thing he'd said. I didn't offer forgiveness that day, nor did he ask for it. But as I left, I told him, "Dad used to say everyone deserves a second chance if they're brave enough to make things right. Do you believe that?" Mason asked. "I'm trying to," I answered truthfully. The rebuilding of Mitchell Hardware continued throughout the following year. We expanded the e-commerce operation while maintaining the personalized service of our physical stores. Patricia and I implemented my father's long-discussed profit-sharing plan for employees, recognizing their loyalty during the company's darkest hours. My mother took on a new role as community liaison, using her natural social skills to rebuild relationships with customers and suppliers who had been wary after the scandal. She seemed to find purpose in this work, often sharing stories about my father's early days building the business relationship by relationship. Uncle Dennis served his sentence without appeal or apparent remorse. My mother occasionally mentioned sending him letters but never pressed me to do the same. Some wounds would take more time to heal, if they ever did. That next Christmas was different again, warmer, more hopeful. Mason joined us briefly, the atmosphere tense but civil. Small steps toward a new kind of family relationship, undefined by the closeness we once had but not destroyed by the betrayal either. As we sat by the fire after dinner, my mother raised her glass in a toast. "To Richard," she said, "who taught us that family is what you make of it, even when it breaks." "To Dad," I echoed, understanding for the first time that preserving his legacy didn't mean preserving a perfect image of our family, but rather holding on to the values he had lived by, integrity, perseverance, and the courage to rebuild what had been broken. In the quiet moments of that evening, watching the fire cast flickering shadows across familiar walls, I reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. The betrayal had cost us much: trust, innocence, the comfortable certainty of family bonds. But it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed and connections that ran deeper than I had realized. Family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about the conscious choice to remain connected even when that connection brings pain alongside joy. It's about holding each other accountable while leaving space for growth and redemption. Most of all, it's about understanding that love isn't always enough. It must be paired with truth, respect, and the willingness to begin again when necessary. As I look back on that difficult chapter of my life, I realize that the greatest lesson wasn't about business or betrayal. It was about the complex, imperfect nature of family bonds and the courage it takes to protect what matters while letting go of what doesn't serve us. Sometimes, the family we rebuild after devastation is stronger than the one we thought was unbreakable. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to move forward? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if it resonated with you. Remember, sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest sources of wisdom and strength. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the courage to face your own family challenges with honesty and hope.